Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Exchange podcast. Today, I'm continuing the conversation with Lou Downe. Lou is the founder and director of the School of Good Services and the former director of design for the UK government. I'm your host, Ari Hirschberg, Senior Engagement Specialist at the Digital Office. Today, Lou joins me from the UK. Lou is the best-selling author of Good Services: How to Design Services That Work. Lou's expertise in service design has helped organizations of all sizes improve their service delivery. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation as Lou answers some of the top questions from the Digital BC livestream. We have some great questions for you. Welcome, Lou.
Thank you for having me, Ari.
Excited to have you. So we have lots of questions from our audience during the live stream, and we pulled out the top 6 questions for you to answer. So what's the biggest barrier to implementing the practice of service design?
That's a really good question. And I'm sure I could probably carry on for a very long time in answering it. But I think the biggest barrier to delivering service design within any organization, and I would include government in that, is the fact that we were often not structured to deliver services. And particularly in the public sector, we were structured to basically take in applications and process those applications and then issue an answer. And so, to a certain extent, our organizations are basically designed a bit like factories. They're not really designed to empower and enable people to listen and learn, what's going on in the world, to be able to respond to those things and to be able to actually completely shift direction. We're not particularly able or good at doing that. And I think that for me is probably the number one barrier to better service delivery. It's our inability to be able to move beyond everything looking like a nail because we have a hammer, and that we have a service, so we look for user needs for that service rather than really rethinking actually what is it we're trying to achieve. And part of that is just to do with the structure and ways of working and the culture that we have within an organization that ultimately is set up to do a very different thing to what it finds itself doing now.
And one of the things is size. I've heard from many people. What is your thoughts on the size?
I think the size of government and the size of government organizations is a challenge. I think at the last count, government was something like 500,000 people here in the UK. I might have got that wrong. But it's very large either way. I think at the last count, it was about the same size as the population of Manchester, which is one of our larger cities here in the UK. So the size of the civil service is huge. And with any large group of people, it's difficult to move quickly in a different direction. And I think that's why a lot of government digital activities have really focused on small groups of people, the unit of delivery being the team, exemplars, kind of proof of concepts, small experiments where we can kind of take a group of people, sort of isolate them to a certain extent and move forward at a different pace. I think what's difficult about that, though, is that because our services are so connected to one another, if you think about something like coming to the UK and staying, for example, you could be dealing with almost 25 different bits of government, depending on what your circumstance is. That is a huge number of people who are going to need to be involved in potentially moving that whole service wholesale into a better experience. So unless we are able to get all of those people on board, we're going to end up with a really fantastic, brilliant part of that service, but we won't end up with a complete service that helps someone to achieve that end goal. And I think that's the real challenge for service design, is actually moving beyond this kind of quite cozy space of sort of isolated transformation into thinking about how do we bring a whole organization with us. And probably that does mean working in a different way. That might mean accepting that we are going to work at the pace of the part of that service that's the slowest, but we will end up with better services as a result, rather than having small isolated parts of change that's very difficult to move a whole organization forward with.
Yeah, well said. The intricacies are amazing, and there's so much to take in to be able to do it. In an organization that doesn't have a service focus orientation, where would we start? And what is a good initial step to start focusing on our service delivery?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the first step that we need to take And it might sound slightly counterintuitive because I think most principles of government digital transformation all start with user needs. And please take what I'm about to say with a pinch of salt, but I don't think that that's necessarily the best place to start. User needs are absolutely vital, but ultimately, when we start with user needs, we end up in this really difficult situation where we don't know which users we're talking about and we don't know which needs we're talking about. And we end up in that situation, like I said before, where because we have a pre-existing service, we go looking for the user needs for that service. So I think the real first thing that we need to do is actually understand, why are we doing what we're doing in the first place? What is the point of it? What's the purpose of our service? Why does it exist? And I think only really by asking that question can we then start to understand actually who is affected by that particular problem. Who are our users ultimately? And what do they need in that context that they find themselves in when they're encountering that particular problem? And ultimately, I think our biggest challenge at the moment is to really understand what our theory of change is. Why are we doing what we're doing? How do we want to make a change in the world? And what are the right tools and instruments to have that happen? The place that we need to start is understanding first what our purpose is, then understanding who our users are, understanding what they need, and then ultimately understanding what the service should be to actually bring those two things together. Those are big questions, though, right? And often we don't have the permission to be able to ask those questions. Nobody has said to us, hey, go and ask, why are we doing what we're doing? And usually it can be really frustrating and frankly quite unwelcome when we ask those questions. So I think often it requires us to kind of nibble backwards into the brief to really understand actually, okay, well, if we have this given service, let's try and articulate what the purpose of that service is and really gently ask those questions to people around us and really slowly over time start to kind of push backwards into that brief whilst really thinking about the conditions that are needed to actually deliver better services. So being able to talk to each other and communicate properly, being able to all understand what we mean by a user, what we mean by a service, or what we mean by a need. Some of those things are things that we, I think, often overlook when we're so busy doing the doing. So that's quite a complicated answer. I can break it down, but I think really the biggest challenge for us is understanding why we're doing what we're doing in the first place.
No, I really like how you explain that. I hear that a lot as the lab grows and grows, the digital office grows and grows, about that one key point to start everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might seem, sort of somewhat blasphemous to say, let's not start with user needs. I don't want it to come across like that. User needs are the most important thing, right? That's why we do what we do. We're here to serve the public, to help them to solve problems and to live better lives ultimately. But what problems are they encountering and how can we support them and help them? Usually the answer to that is somewhere buried in a policy that we have been handed, that the person who's written it has long since disappeared, that may have been written 50, 100 years ago. So the process of understanding why we're doing what we're doing is difficult because it's often a process of archaeology to understand actually what like, why did this thing exist? And sometimes it requires us to kind of retrofit needs onto those things. Often we have services where actually the service predates the current need of it. Our births, deaths, and marriages service dates to the 1840s. The public welfare set of services that rely on that register of births, deaths, and marriages only started existing in the 40s and 50s. So sometimes it requires us to kind of almost retrofit and go, okay, how are we using it right now? What do people need from this service right now? And to sort of hold up that kind of original purpose with the purpose it now has and try and sort of work out what good looks like in the middle.
Oh, it's such an amazing puzzle to play with.
Yeah, it really is. And I think sometimes feel like an archaeologist, sort of dusting off this very old service and going, what on earth was this thing for? Like everyone has long since disappeared. It's like finding this kind of object and going, okay, was it a cooking object? Was it something that people used to garden with? Like what is this thing?
And I do like the way you use the word archaeology, and then you say things like things have been back as far as the 1800s in the UK. That's mind-boggling.
Oh, that's not even the oldest service. I mean, I am a massive service geek. The oldest service, I think, is the fishing rod license service, and it dates back to Henry VIII. And if you ever want to, and you are an equally massive nerd as me, and you come over to the UK, you can see the original service design for this service written on the back of a piece of animal skin, and it's in the National Archives. And it's basically a service to regulate fishing. And this is actually a really great example of where the current user need is totally different to what it was originally designed for, because it was originally designed to basically stop peasants from stealing fish from basically wealthy landowners' land. And now it's a really important service that basically the money from these fishing rod licenses goes to the, upkeep of our inland rivers and waterways. So it's hugely important, but totally different to what we originally intended it for.
Yeah, but a great story.
Yeah.
So, how do you grapple with the issue that fixing legacy systems isn't sexy or doesn't help leaders get accolades so the shiny thing gets more attention?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is a perpetually exhausting topic, isn't it? I think we're kind of always feeling like we're being bombarded with the next technology that someone is running off with. And, it used to be blockchain, didn't it? And then we realized that that went horribly wrong. Now we're in a world of AI and an increasingly escalating set of language around that, as, people like to technology drop in meetings to show how clever they are. One way of dealing with it is to not, to just let it pass you by, to realize actually that first of all, we do have to fix the basics. We have, in order to use all of the benefits of this amazing future technology, of which will be important and really vital to us, we need to have consistent data sets. We need to have a record of people and things and a list of businesses and a list of individuals, and we need to have a consistent understanding of what we mean by a business or an individual or a car or a motorist or any of these things that we rely on for our services to exist. That, like you say, it's not sexy, but telling someone that they can't have all of this really amazing future technology without that is a motivating factor. And so if we've been waiting for someone to pay attention to the fact that we don't have consistent data around a particular thing, and we want to motivate them to give us some money to do that, usually that's a pretty good way of doing it. But I think it's also important that we don't just ignore those things, because I do think there's a little bit of cynicism towards new technologies, particularly when we are spending so much of our time, kind of like deep in the kind of cesspit of legacy technology. Sometimes there might be a way out of our situation by looking at what might be next and what might be coming. And I think particularly when we have a situation where often these technologies will happen to us anyway, it's really important that we pay attention, particularly around things like AI. We're finding that large bits of our processes are potentially being automated by large technology suppliers. Do we have a say in that and in the morality around our decision making at the moment? No, we don't. So we really do need to actively engage in those conversations and not just push them to the side and say, well, we'll get to those in 10 years' time, because someone will basically go and find an agency and they'll get them to deliver that anyway. I know, because I've had that happen to me.
Yeah, and especially with the speed of AI right now, that's a good example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also understanding the implications of those things on user behavior as well. I think sometimes we just think about the technology, and in reality, technology is just a way of accelerating and facilitating an existing behavior that we're trying to drive towards. And I think what's really fascinating about AI is that it's a way of facilitating getting rid of the boundaries between search and static websites. And that's a pattern of behavior that we've been seeing for a really long time, that actually the internet, with our current understanding of it as basically being a search engine with loads of static stuff on it, probably is going to cease to exist at some point within our lifetimes, as we start to see content and interactions happen within platforms and within those walled gardens. It's going to make me sound like a very old person now, but I personally believe very strongly in net neutrality and the neutrality of the internet. And, things being able to be found and used. That's the best thing about the internet is its neutral position for anyone to do anything. There are also a lot of harms that come from that as well. So I do think there's a real attention that we need to pay to the user behavior that sits behind a lot of these technologies to understand actually what the implications of that are on what we do, even if the technology itself might change.
Have you ever come across a situation where the research sheds light on the problem not being approached quite right, but this light is not welcome because it shows the cracks? And have you ever experienced pushback from leadership, and how do you navigate that situation?
Have I ever experienced pushback from leadership? Gosh, I feel like a tree that has lent into the wind of the pushback from leadership. I am bent into the shape of that in the best way possible. I think this is just the day-to-day life, right, of people who are trying to make change in any organization. And I think that is a really difficult thing to come to terms with, because it does require us to pace ourselves and understand what work looks like in an environment where very often the main part of our job is explaining why we're in the room in the first place. So yes, is the answer, long-winded answer to that. I have absolutely experienced that. When we're in that situation, certainly what I have found in that situation is that we need to change our language to match the people that we are communicating with. And I'm sure that other guests on the show have also said the same thing. We need to speak the language of the people that we're talking to. And often the language that they are talking is a language of risk, and it's a language of money. And this is the reason why, having studied fine art originally, I went off and decided that I really needed to study economics, because that's the language that any business talks. And particularly now, when we're facing increasing amounts of austerity, certainly here in the UK, we've had a long history of austerity to our public services. The same is true in many other countries as well. We need to prove the cost implications of the work that we're proposing. So if we want to make a really radical change to our service, okay, cool. Why? What money is that going to save us? And usually it's going to save us money in terms of in reduced calls, reduced processing, duplication of effort, but we'll also see reduced risks, particularly, kind of risks around data leaks, risks around operational, reputational damage, those sorts of things. So I think as designers, user researchers, people who are kind of advocating for user experience often feel like someone needs to agree with us for the right reasons. And actually, it doesn't really matter why they agree with us. If they agree with us because it's going to reduce the amount of cost to the business or to, the amount of risk, does it really matter that they don't necessarily care about that problem for the same reasons as we care about it, that it's going to make people's lives better? Not really. So I would caution anyone who's going through this particular situation to really, really think about how they're communicating what they're trying to do to the organization. Really look at the language. And if user needs and services and being user-centric in general is not cutting it, think about using a different language. Think about doing an economic study of your service and really recording how much is it costing right now? How much do you think you might be able to save? And to go back to the School of Good Services, this is why we decided to provide a course in just this, because this is often not what we are trained and taught to do as designers and user researchers, and frankly anyone actually. But increasingly we're being asked to, when we do any piece of work, write a business case for that work. So we decided that we needed to come up with a course to help people to write business cases for service design, which are not the same as your average technology business case or other things, because we're talking about very complex costs that are spread across lots of different areas. So sorry, very long-winded answer to your question, Ari.
I don't think anything will be cut on that, because there's so many gems in there about how we spend so much time working and trying to get our thoughts across because we care so much. I mean, everyone cares in their work, but I love working in the government. I've worked here for 7 years. People really care about their services, and you could spend 100 hours writing up a paper that doesn't do anything, but you could spend 40 hours doing it, and you could get a lot of traction because you figured out the angles and the lenses that you just didn't see before.
Exactly. And I think this is why we sort of talk about multidisciplinary teams as if it's just a fait accompli, like it's just something that happens, right? But this is why it's so important. And I think often there's certain skills that we just overlook in those teams, economists being one of them. Having an economist in your team is like a superpower, being able to see what the cost currently is and where you can make those savings. Equally, where you can reduce the opportunity cost of users. If you can say, well, currently businesses spend on average this amount of time applying for this particular license. If they didn't, they would be able to spend this amount of time doing something else. That's the kind of thing that really matters to policymakers, to say, actually, we're going to get out of the way. Government is going to facilitate these better outcomes for less money. Who wouldn't say yes to that?
Yes. So here's a question. We work with really vulnerable people. Are there specific things we can do to improve how we build our services for them? And given this, in the public sector, how can we do this without enough money for the gold standard of IT services?
It's funny how often accessibility and inclusion is shortly followed in the same sentence by cost. And I would question that question a little bit, because I think often when it comes to public services, people who are excluded from the rest of society are overrepresented in our services for the very reason that they are more reliant on the type of support the government provides because they have been excluded. And so our services should be the gold standard. Our services are there to provide 100% of service to 100% of people 100% of the time. I think it's really troubling when we don't necessarily have that at the core of our understanding of accessibility and inclusion. We see it as a nice to have, a enhancement to our work. I think a lot of the narratives around the benefit of testing from an inclusion point of view are often to blame for this. We think, well, we'll do 80-20. If I had a pound for every time someone had said, well, we're here to meet 80% of the needs, you will make your service work for the 80% of people if you test it with the 20% of people who are excluded. And there are so many good examples of this, particularly from a product design perspective. The Good Grips peeler is a great example of this. If anyone hears this story and has one of these in their kitchen drawer, it was designed by someone who basically had physical problems holding a traditional peeler. She wasn't a designer or a product designer. She was a chef originally, and she designed something that worked for her. And it is a perfect example of the fact that if we design for services and products for people who struggle the most, we will end up making them work for everyone. So we should always do that accessibility and inclusion testing first before we do anything else. It will help us to accelerate our learning. But I would also caution my own argument there, because it's an inherently ableist argument, right? To say, well, if we test it with people who will struggle the most, therefore it will work for everyone. We should just be making our public services work for everyone, because people who are excluded from the rest of society are going to be more reliant on our services. So building that empathy with our organization is going to be really important to have that narrative actually really resonate. And part of the reason why we really struggle to understand and empathize with users who are excluded is because our organizations are monocultures. It might sound really harsh, but we are often not representative of the societal needs that we're meeting. Realizing that, coming to terms with it, and saying, okay, let's not spend ages beating ourselves up about this, but let's do something about it. Let's go and understand those groups. Let's make sure that also our organizations are more diverse in the background, and also try to build that empathy is really important. I think sometimes this kind of sense of shame at not wanting to be seen to not know the answer to a question, or not knowing the needs of a particular group, or actually sometimes not even knowing that group exists, is what really holds us back from actually building that empathy. So yeah, a little bit of kind of just safe space to ask questions, I think, goes a long way.
Yeah, because it's so important, and we're still so young at figuring this out now, because it's now become an important issue that wasn't even a while back, and now is like it's crucial. And now we're learning it from scratch, many of us.
Yeah, exactly. And I think often it requires us to keep pushing ourselves as well. I do think there is a bit of resting on our laurels sometimes when we say, oh, well, we've done, all of the testing against this particular standards, whether it's, kind of WCAG, AA, AAA, wherever we feel like we need to get to. And what we've done is make sure that our service works for people who often have very specific needs of assistive technology, which is really important. But we haven't thought about all the other reasons why someone might be excluded, because they don't have access to a printer, or they can't talk to us within business hours because they're a carer, or they need to change their sex or gender in a service and they can't. There are often things that are not just to do with what we can and can't do, but to do with our identity or things that we have access to, that are also going to really profoundly exclude people from services if we don't really consider them.
Yes, this could be something we could talk about for a very
It's a
long
whole
time.
other topic on which I would be happy to talk about.
Yeah, me too. But let me get to the next question. And then if you have any final thoughts on that question, please come back after. How do you recommend supporting ministries move from only design research to doing full service design process? For example, prototyping, iterating, testing, and implementing.
Yeah, I feel a certain frustration in the question there of someone who's in a situation perhaps maybe where they are finding out things from doing user research that they are not able to deliver and move forwards. My first answer to that question would be just to take a deep breath. Often the things that we're aiming to do, these massive changes to our services and to our organizations, will take a long time. And that is okay. You haven't failed just because you haven't delivered that thing tomorrow. Change comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And if you've convinced one person that, this is the right thing to do, and if it takes 18 months for them to get there, that's what success looks like too, as well as, having a clickable thing on the internet. So that's the first thing to say. I think the second thing to do is to really acknowledge that the job of service design is about 10% design and about 90% creating the conditions for service design to happen. And we can kind of fight against that, and we can go, no, but the 10% is the fun bit, and the 10% is the user research and the workshops and the user journey mapping. And, we can forever be frustrated in that position, or we can acknowledge that actually that 90% is really valid work, and the meetings and the making the case for our work and the explaining over and over again why we're in the room is the work. And so there's a certain amount of just kind of sitting with that and really acknowledging what skills are required in that space. And so I would say to anyone who's in that situation, look at what you're finding difficult, on a day-to-day basis. Look at what you think the barriers and blockers to actually moving forward and delivering your work actually are. Write a list of those things. Think about the things that you feel comfortable doing on that list. Think about the things that actually you feel like you need some support and help with to do on that list. And go and find people who might be able to help you with a different perspective on that. So if you feel like actually no one's listening to you because everyone cares about money and you can't explain what you're doing in monetary terms, go and find someone in the organization who has those skills or that perspective, because they will exist. And often they'd be really happy to have a conversation with you about your way of seeing things. So I would say just don't fall into the trap of being afraid to admit where you don't know how to move forward with a certain thing. And often the skills that are required to actually go beyond just talking about good service design to actually delivering them are not things that we learned in university. They're not things that are in design courses or user research courses, or even things that we will naturally pick up as part of our day-to-day experience. I think we often convince ourselves that confidence is the answer, and in reality, it's very much not. Confidence is just a bit of a misnomer that we'll carry on chasing. We never think we have enough. And really, the people who get stuff to happen in organizations are often the people who would say they are the least confident. And the reason for that is because they're the people who have prepared. They're the people who've really done the research about their stakeholders. They've understood who those people are and what they care about, what they're worried about, what they're going to say yes to, what they're going to say no to, and they have prepared for every single meeting. And that is the preparation that we need to do. And often that requires a totally different skill set. So that's totally fine. Just, make a list of what those things are you think they are, go and ask other people, go and seek out that knowledge. It might come from a totally different industry, might be economics, might be linguistics, might be, data science, might be something else. So yeah.
We've been trying to build really strong communities of practices and finding places and ways so people can talk to each other more to get these answers. But I am curious how many economists we're going to hear from in the next while who are going to be helping out work, because it's something I hadn't heard until your live stream. That's another great group of people to have in the room.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. And also, I would say business analysts. I think often there's a real butting of heads sometimes between service design and business analysis. I think sometimes they're very adjacent jobs that are kind of fighting a little bit for the middle ground. Business analysis is often a profession that has really detailed process maps and schematics of services. Often they're the only people who know how those services work. So finding those people, I think, as well as the economists in the room and policymakers, of course, yeah, finding those service design adjacent roles and going and learning as much as you can from them.
That's wonderful. Any final thoughts?
I will give a shameless plug to some of our courses at the School of Good Services because they are precisely designed to help people who are in those situations. So we do obviously a writing business cases for service design course, which if you're in the situation where you're having to, make the case for service design is a really great place to start. We also do a one-day course on leading stakeholders. So if you find yourself in that situation where you are the herder of many different stakeholders all going in different directions, which probably most people will find themselves in that situation, we also have a course in that as well. But there's also lots of free blog posts and tools and other useful stuff on good.services as well. So do go and check that out.
Thank you, Lou, for taking the time to share your thoughts. To the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode with Lou Downe, founder and director of the School of Good Services and the former director of design for the UK government. You can connect with me at the digital office at do.contentdesign@gov.pc.ca or click the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.